But it takes time, and now, for instance, in Egypt, after the overthrow of the regime, we will see now different groups, different parties, different sects, some nationalists, some leftists, some centrists, Muslim Brotherhood, some religious group which are not linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, student revolutionaries. All these groups are coming together to form a coalition, to form government. And is it chaotic? Yes, it is chaotic. It's going to be chaotic. It's going to be messy. I mean, that's a sign of the healthy democratic system. It's I don't think in overnight we're going to see Switzerland in these countries. Back to your point about Syria, I think more importantly, what we're witnessing in Syria is some sort of tug of war between Iran and the other Arab Gulf states, specifically Qatar and Saudi Arabia. I'm not mentioning Jordan or Iraq because they are taking different position than Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Iran, on one hand, you see that it's trying to support the Syrian regime, and Saleh, the foreign minister, recently said that any political change in Syria should come within the framework of the Assad regime, and they don't want to see the regime is removed from power. They support them militarily, they support them diplomatically.
Before we go to the break, it has nothing to do with democracy, okay, and the welfare of the Syrian people, right? All of this Western media coverage is this junk then.
Well,
yeah.
Well, I think, it depends on who you look. For instance, if you took an Iranian position,
Majid, let me jump in here. We're going to go to a short break. I'll go back to you after the short break. After our short break, we'll continue our discussion on the Arab Spring and counter-revolution. Stay with RT. Okay, Majid, I'd like to go back to you in Los Angeles because we were both having an exchange before the break here. I mean, you were bringing up a point, but maybe for a different reason. But, you know, a lot of what's going on with the quote-unquote Arab awakening is geopolitics, and I don't think many people really want to deny that, though we get these kind of heart-wrenching stories coming out of Syria, and they are terrible stories. But I mean, it's really kind of a geopolitical game now. They're taking the Arab Spring, the great ideas of the Arab Spring, of the people on the ground, and they're being used for geopolitical aims. In the United States, NATO has already been mentioned here. We have Saudi Arabia, a major player, and of course, a lot of it is directed against Iran. So it's not really about great ideals, is it? It's just about power as usual.
Well, I don't think so. I think geopolitics is important, and the sociopolitical and socio-religious elements are important. So we can, for instance, let's say if United States asked Hosni Mubarak to step aside, I don't think so. United States should, every Arab country who faced uprising, United States should immediately ask the head of that state to step aside. I think would be simplistic, unrealistic, and doesn't reflect the reality on the ground. I think, and doesn't reflect the complexity of the socio-politics of the different country in the Middle East. Yes, strategic, geopolitical elements are very important. But I think we have really a new phenomenon here. If you see, like, what I notice is that you see United States or European countries are not taking, in regard with Syria or Egypt or other Libya or Yemen, they're not taking a unilateral actions. If you see their as a Secretary of State.
Oh, come on. When the United States says, when Hillary Clinton says, this leader must go, okay, that's pretty unilateral sounding to me, and it sounds very definite as well. What right does the United States have to say what leaders should stay and what should go?
If I might come in here...
VJ, jump in, go ahead.
If I might come in here, yes, you know, I think that we have to, first of all, get rid of some illusions. One is that I think we exaggerate what we mean by unilateralism. I would like to suggest that when most of these powers act, they always attempt the fig leaf of the Security Council or the so-called coalitions of the willing. Very rarely has there been one country, as it were, going it alone. If you look back from the period after the end of the Soviet Union forward, most of the interventions have happened either with Security Council authorization beforehand or a Security Council authorization once the invasion has begun. And that latter example, of course, is Kosovo, where the war begins and then they go to the Security Council for authorization. So I think let's not have a caricatured idea of unilateralism in order to debunk it. You know, there has now been a study of the Libyan war, and what it demonstrated was that even though it was under the flag of NATO, the bulk of the military actual assets that were involved were from the United States. In fact, the New York Times in an editorial said that the Europeans are not ready for prime time. In other words, it was a NATO intervention, but behind NATO, largely the armaments were the United States. And right now, given that the United States has created a new platform with the so-called Arab NATO, the Gulf Cooperation, GCC organization, Hillary Clinton was at this new forum, putting the United States in an active alliance with the GCC. This demonstrates a continuity of strategy, where the United States is working with its so-called regional allies to maintain its own national interests overseas. And in fact, when there were protests against Mubarak, it was, after all, Frank Wisner Jr. who was sent as the envoy to talk to Mubarak and to try to find a strategy to lengthen Mubarak's tenure, not to ask him to step aside. In fact, Frank Wisner Jr., in his memorable television uplink to the Munich conference, said that he had discussed a democratic transformation with Saudi Arabia. You know, all ironies intended. Imagine that an American envoy is talking about democracy with Riyadh regarding a protest movement in Cairo. It's ridiculous.
Angela, where do you come out on that? Because, of course, some countries, some people in the Arab Middle East can have the Arab Spring, the Arab Awakening, but some can't. Bahrain's a good example. They can't, okay? So that is, again, it gets down
Certainly.
just to power
And the
politics.
GCC.
Go ahead.
Sure, there's a lot of suspicion in this part of the world. Some countries it's okay for destabilization. Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, we need to keep stability in the Gulf. They're allies with Iraq and Afghanistan. The oil connection is obvious. Here there's been, Hillary Clinton was in Saudi Arabia the very weekend when the UAE kicked out the National Democratic Institute, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and some other pro-democracy, pro-human rights organizations that had been operating here. And the reaction from the State Department was, we wish it hadn't happened. Far, far different than what you're seeing in some of the other Arab countries. So certainly decisions are being made about which of these uprisings are going to get strong support and which of these uprisings will just sort of see what happens. In the Gulf, other than Bahrain and in Yemen, Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia's had some clashes, but life has, for the most part, gone on. And any time you had a little bit of dissent, it has been quickly squelched in the last year. And in fact, the pace of that is being increased in the last 6 months.
Okay, Majid, if I can go back to you in Los Angeles, does it bother you that the United States is so selective on who was supported with great ideas like democracy and civil society and others that are not? Because, my goodness, what is the kind of trust level can anyone have with the United, even these medieval regimes like Saudi Arabia? My goodness, the United States says one thing and does another with others. It's just a policy of hypocrisy.
Well, I think it's not selectiveness. I'm just going to explain it again. I think there are, first we should see the level of atrocity that committed by different Arab regimes. We can't really generalize and put one picture over all of them. Again, I'm saying this is very simplistic, unrealistic, and doesn't reflect the complexity of each country in the region. When we talk about, let's say, Bahrain, the level of atrocity which was committed by Bahrain compared to Syria, which the United States asked Assad to step aside, is infinitesimal. Syria has killed, the number of people killed in Syria are more than the combination of all other people killed in the uprising in the last year. And I mean, my own family also live in Syria, and I have also, I mean, direct reports of the atrocity which are committed in Syria, which is unprecedented. I mean, so you can't really, I think there are different steps you have to take, and the United States have taken. First, you use diplomacy, then you use dialogue. If it didn't work, you use sanctions. And if sanctions didn't work, then you take other actions to stop the violence in that country. And I think
does that include militarizing the conflict there? The rebels, the quote-unquote rebels, should be armed by outsiders. That you saying that? That just contributes to more violence.
Okay,
doesn't it?
Okay, so here I wanted again to refer back to my point that United States has not taken a unilateral action. For instance, in case of Libya that your other guest mentioned, it was the Arab League who imposed the no-fly zone, and the Arab League who pushed the Western countries to actually
pushed Western countries. Vijay, jump in.
Not at all.
They were pushed.
Not at all.
Go ahead.
This is a historical point. This is a Bordlerization of history. It's important to remember that the Arab League is a deeply divided organization, and very rarely do both sides of the Arab League come to a single conclusion. At the meeting of the Arab League, where there was a discussion about a no-fly zone, only 11 of the 22 members had come to that meeting, and most of them were the 7 countries that belong to the GCC. In that meeting, the Saudis and the Qataris took the lead. In that meeting, they did indeed call for a no-fly zone and gave cover to the NATO countries in the UN Security Council to push for Resolution 1973. That was in early March. In May, at the May meeting of the Arab League, the Qataris put forward their candidate to be the next General Secretary. He used to be the General Secretary of the GCC, but at the May meeting, the rest of the Arab League that had come to basically critique the GCC refused to allow the GCC candidate, that is the Arab NATO candidate, to become the head of the Arab League, and they instead chose Nabil el-Arabi, who is the current head of the Arab League. Again, the Arab League recently met in Baghdad, just this previous month. Half the members once again came. The GCC countries basically boycotted the Arab League meeting in Baghdad. Only Kuwait came for it, and the reason they didn't agree with the Arab League this time is over so-called overflights of Iranian flights going to Syria.
All right. So Vijay, let me jump in here. We're running out of time.
I think we should be extremely specific.
I agree with you. Are we going to be talking about the Arab Spring for the next year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years?
Well, I think we're going to be talking about the Arab Spring because, as I said, I mean, changing from autocracy to democracy really takes time, energy, and efforts, and this will not happen overnight. Again, some countries are going through the phase of revolution still, like Syria, and the people are not anymore afraid of the rulers' bullets and guns and
Vijay, what about you?
Streets.
What about you? How long are we going to be talking about the Arab Spring?
I'm looking forward. Peter, I'm looking forward to traveling with you to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where our taxi driver will be a woman, and you and I will sit in an open-air cafe and discuss freedom in the Gulf region.
Okay. Angela, what about you? Do you think that's ever going to happen?
I'd like to join that trip.
Okay. I want to thank all of my guests
like to join
here.
That trip.
Maybe we'll all be in a bus one day in Riyadh here. Many thanks to my guests today in Chicopee, Los Angeles, and in Dubai. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.